me. I've watched you on television. You're a real beauty.
But I will do it my way, which is always an unusual way.
That's not rigged. I think it's just a dumb process.
Keno. It's on-the-spot fun.
You ain't playing baseball this year.
That's some of the week's news out of context, and it's the Wheelhouse, our weekly news roundtable here on WNPR. I'm John Dankosky, executive editor of the New England News Collaborative. Here to hopefully provide a bit of context is Colin McEnroe, as always. He's host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Hello once again, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also with us is Kalila Brown-Dean, associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. Hello once again, Professor.
Hi, John.
And also with us is Danny Haar. He's columnist for the Hartford Courant. Hello there, Dan.
Good morning.
You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. You can also find us on CTN, the Connecticut Network. They're here with their cameras today. Let's start, though, with something we were talking about a bit last week. The Bond Commission finally met and approved some money for several business entities, including $22 million for the world's biggest hedge fund, Bridgewater. One of the frequent dissenting voices on the Bond Commission is Representative Chris Davis. He's a Republican from Ellington.
This company is already committing $500 million. They're willing to do that. They're willing to do that for the state of Connecticut. And my concern is, why are we giving them this extra $22 million out of public funds if they're already willing to commit that $500 million on their own?
Now, of course, Governor Malloy brushed off this criticism.
I don't worry about what people are going to say. What I worry about is whether we're growing our economy. And in this transaction, we are substantially growing our tax base with a very small level of investment.
And we'll talk a bit more about how much this could or could not grow the economy, and hear from someone who chimed in last week after we talked about this a bit. There was a second no vote, though. It wasn't just the Republican, Davis. It was also Comptroller Kevin Lembo, who's a Democrat. Here's a bit of what he said in a statement. He said, "It's indisputable that Connecticut faces a new economic reality, one that warrants reevaluation of our economic development strategy, especially as the state faces ongoing cuts to services and the layoff of thousands of employees." Essentially, Kevin Lembo, Colin, saying he's not going to vote for $22 million for Bridgeport. Now that we've had a week to digest this and think about it, anything change in your mind around this?
Well, no, but then I'm not really sure I had an exactly well-formed opinion about this even last week. I mean, look, Kevin Lembo talks about how there's a new economic reality. In fact, there's sort of a series of different economic realities. I mean, bonding didn't used to really be about this. Bonding used to be, the old economic reality was bonding was for stuff that the people use, right? It was for bridges and roads and aquifers and I don't know what else. I guess that was only the Romans who used it. But viaducts or something. But so, that's what bonding was, this notion that you were going to do bonding so that you could essentially bribe companies to either do more business in your state or not leave your state or come to your state or whatever. That's a relatively, and Dan may have some idea how recently, but it's a relatively recent addition to our understanding of what the common weal is. So I guess sort of that's step one, but we committed to that strategy a long time ago. Then, as Kevin Lembo is suggesting, do we have the kind of money left to play this kind of game? And one of the things that Keith Fanoff says every time he's in here is we've spent so much money on this game that we really can't do the other stuff. And if Keith were here, he would explain this better, but that in fact, there are bond approvals for all kinds of capital improvements that we really can't actually do because we've got so much money committed. There's so much money in the pipeline committed to this kind of first five bribe the private sector strategy. And when we get to the part of this conversation that's about Aetna, you see a situation where even if we wanted to bribe them, we don't have the kind of money anymore to do that.
Well, and that's the thing that Keith does keep reporting on, Kalila, this notion that we have these bond commission meetings and we approve an awful lot of stuff for the things that Colin says we used to bond for, like bridges and roads, but then we never actually spend that money because we can't really find a way to do it. Is this the way to use bond money? I mean, Colin uses the word bribe. I think some economists might use a different word. What do you think?
Well, I think we're always in this state of how much we can bribe or entice people to stay when we know that there's such competition with other states. So in the long term, is this sustainable? But I think it's also a very difficult sell for citizens of this state because they're seeing what these cuts are going to do in an immediate sense. So it's hard to tell people down where I am in New Haven that we're cutting out these mental health programs, but we have this money to support Bridgewater. Even if it's about keeping certain jobs in, most folks don't understand how hedge funds work. So this is poor optics, but it also has an impact on voter trust.
Dan?
There are a lot of first of alls here. First of all, we've had 24 years since our friend Joe McGee, as Commissioner of Economic Development, gave some number of millions of dollars to Swiss Bank under Governor Weicker. And the modern era of corporate, call it what you will, green mail, bribery, began then in Connecticut. It was a little earlier across the country.
See, I
but
knew he'd know.
We've pretty much had 24 years to mock and talk about the bad optics, as Kalila says, of all these things. Why now do we pick arguably the single best deal we've ever done with a corporation to pick on it? I get that they have $169 billion under management. I get that the CEO, yes, but and more importantly, even than that, is the fact that Ray Dalio, the CEO of Bridgewater, in a bad year makes about $1.2 billion. That's with a B. That's personal income. That's not what the company makes. That's he himself. In a good year, Forbes has reported 4.5. Institutional investor has reported 3.5. They're such big numbers that they're gaudy. We get that. This is the best deal for the numbers that we've ever seen, dollar for dollar. This is coming out at about it's something like $6,000 per job. It's a crazy low number. It's not 6; it's about 8. We typically pay between $20,000 and $45,000 or even $50,000 per job. This is a deal, and if they leave, as the governor said, Controller Lembo would be the first to close.
Well, so walk us through that a little bit. I mean, take us through the deal and what exactly this deal means, Danny, when you talk about how many dollars we're spending per job. I mean, is it about the amount of money that the people who are going to be employed by Bridgewater, these new jobs, are going to make, and the fact that they're high-income earners and they're going to put a lot back into our tax base? Does it have to do with economic growth that comes out of paying these particular people? Explain this to us.
Yeah, Bridgewater now has about 1,200 people. You recall that we, as a state, not the four of us here, but we as a state, offered them $115 million to move from, I believe, Westport to Stamford, down on the waterfront. That's right. Where the harbor park and all that stuff was built, and it's beautiful down there. But it didn't work out for them to move
and
there.
I'm just going to stop you quickly and say, in case you're trying to say that we were just now ringing the bell about this being a deal, I think many of us were ringing that bell a couple of years ago when there was going to be a huge palace on the water in Stamford that a whole bunch of fishermen and pleasure boat guys down in Stamford decided to deep six. Anyway, so this isn't the first time Bridgewater got to the...
Fair point.
Okay.
So to move quickly through this, the $22 million is for them to remain where they are. $15 million of it would be forgiven if they add 750 jobs over a certain number of years. It would not be forgiven if they don't do that. And the rest of the $7 million is for training and some other stuff that people made up just to give them $7 million that is forgiven. So they can do their own training. So looked at as a whole.
Yes.
The amount, I did a little sort of back of the envelope stuff on this. The $22 million would be returned just by the $1,200 people who are here if they decide not to move. These are very mobile companies. They don't have to stay here. They would be returned within about 3 years.
And I'll just say, after last week's show, we quickly got a comment from UConn economist Fred Karstensen, who said essentially what you're saying, Dan, Bridgewater, if the numbers are roughly correct, $500 million in new investments, 750 additional highly paid employees. Essentially, Fred said it's a hell of a deal for the state. Colin?
Yeah, actually, you left out the beginning of the email, which I think was, you idiots.
I don't think it was that strong. It was something like that.
Well, in tone. So, obviously here, look, part of the problem is, just to be overarching for one moment, is federalism, is that, in fact, our country has turned into, instead of a republic, a line of 50 gas stations with different prices posted. And everybody who wants to do business in America just drives up and down this huge continental Berlin turnpike looking for the best gas price, the equivalent of the best gas price. And so, I mean, it really makes it difficult to plan services, to plan anything, because that's the way we do business. Certainly there's a lot of other people who have a lot more sophistication about this kind of stuff than I do, like practically everybody. And so it's very hard to argue back against Fred Karstensen or Danny Haar, But it even Fred's email, I'm looking at it right now. I mean, there used to be this guy on Green Acres named Mr. Haney, and Mr. Haney would show up and he would always offer, various kinds of various dubious sounding deals. By 2021, when Bridgewater is committed to having another $750 on its payroll, the state should be collecting something like $5 million in additional state revenue annually, just that 1 year. So assume state revenue benefit only 2021 to 2037 when the bonds have to be retired in those 17 years. State revenue should be up in aggregate by $85 million.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you there just in part because part of what I think I was reading in Fred's note is in those 17 years, revenues should be up in aggregate. Look, there's a lot of shoulds here, Kalila, and there's a lot of what ifs. There's a lot of, I think, reliance on the possibility that we're going to get tax income from new upper income earners. Aren't these the same people who we rely so heavily on for their income taxes right now that we've got a gigantic hole in the state budget because they haven't done so well in the last couple of years?
Exactly. And we should not be in the situation that we're in as a state, but we are. So, Colin, you talked about these 50 gas stations. It makes a difference if you're paying cash or credit, the price that you get. So if these companies are mobile, why aren't their workers mobile as well? If you're looking at that development in Fairfield County, many of those younger professionals may say, maybe I'd rather live in the city or maybe I'd rather go other places. Maybe if I'm that good, I can get a job somewhere else. So all of these intangibles, I think, again, as a long-term strategy, put Connecticut right back into the situation we're in.
Well, okay, so Dan, give us some context with this, including what's happening with Aetna now. So, the Bridgewater ship has sailed. The state has decided to commit a certain amount of money to help Bridgewater stay where it is. You, Fred Carstensen, say it's a good deal. Some people, Kevin Limbo, aren't so sure it's a good deal. Now we're worried about Aetna, this huge employer here in Hartford, one of the landmark names not only in Connecticut history but also certainly in the insurance sector, may be making noises about leaving too. What's the context there for Aetna in all of this?
Darling, I love you. Just give me the high-speed rail. The context is pretty much exactly what we're talking about. Aetna, by the way, it's precisely a year ago today, June 1st, that both Aetna and GE issued their shots across the bow with statements, both public statements, saying if we don't like what we're seeing, and we may move operations. And GE moved its headquarters, but not most of the thousands of jobs that remain here that were GE jobs, and some of them still are. And Aetna hasn't done anything yet, but it seems to be threatening. I think the context is there is a false dichotomy between cost. It's not about cost here versus cost somewhere else. Yes, it is a Berlin Turnpike line of gas stations, but the gas stations are offering different gas, right? And so what we need to do is offer value, and that's exactly what Kalila was just talking about. I disagree with her on what that deal says about offering value. I think it offers great value because it offers density. Aetna is a different situation. They're moving people to where they need people strategically. I don't think they are going to move a headquarters function to Louisville, Kentucky. Why would they do that? If they move a headquarters function, I would suggest it would be to the Washington, D.C. area of Bethesda, where they have already a lot of people.
Don't give them that idea. They're listening, Danny.
Thanks, Dan.
So really, we appreciate that.
They're smart people. But let's be clear. They're talking about moving. What they're looking at moving are some of the jobs that go along with the merger and the global headquarters. These are prestigious location jobs, but they're not the thousands of jobs. Aetna isn't going to get pick up and move. A friend of ours did it for Trinity College. He's doing a project on how to reuse the Aetna headquarters, the giant colonial building. And I posted on Facebook, I said, well, Chris, they're not leaving. He goes, well, you have to be prepared. And so the mentality is they're leaving. They're not leaving. They may move a few hundred very important jobs.
Okay, a few hundred very important jobs, but, there's only a couple hundred jobs that moved with the GE headquarters, and it seems like it's all that people are concerned about at the Capitol. It seems to have put nails in the coffin of Connecticut, Colin, at least if you hear some people tell the tale.
Right. Well, just to continue Danny's theme, Hartford is where I'd rather stay. I get allergic smelling bluegrass.
All those horses.
All those horses. So one of the problems about this, I'm glad you mentioned GE, is the companies aren't always clear, or I would even say honest, about what they're doing and why they're doing it. So this whole situation is muddied by the fact that GE, they didn't move everybody from Fairfield to Boston. In all the ways that Danny's talking about, they strategically moved jobs around. Some of them came to Boston from Fairfield. Some of them came to Boston from other places. Some people who were in Fairfield went to other places. So, I mean, it winds up devolving into this story that GE moved its headquarters to Boston. That's not really quite true. Not true the way it sounds anyway. And I would agree that it's unlikely that they're going to do this. Here's my one contribution to this whole idea. I think one thing that we can do that we should have done a long time ago that doesn't cost that much money is really work to redevelop the area around the Aetna headquarters, not with a sort of gentrification idea of driving out some of the businesses and stuff that serve the residential population there, whose needs and economies are very different from the people who work in those buildings. But, I mean, it really is like when you think about how big an employer Aetna is and how big a deal Aetna is, it's really kind of shameful and shocking how little there is around that space that in any way connects to what they're doing there. They can't even keep that old Aetna Diner, Comet, Oasis, Hopbrook, the thing that's been about 19 different things. Dishes, you know. They can't even keep that thing open under one management. And it seems to me if Luke Bronin, I know he's got no money to do anything, but it costs a lot less money to really work on having a much more friendly climate that also helps using shuttles and stuff like that to integrate the Aetna even more with downtown than to bribe them to stay here.
Well, okay, so if we're going to use money, and let's get back to the beginning of this, Kalila. Here's what we used to do at bond commission hearings, right? We bond for big transportation projects that we need money for that cost way too much money for the private sector to do anything about. So we build roads. Right now there's a plan out there to rebuild the Aetna Viaduct. It's called that because it runs right next to Aetna. It's the I-84 corridor that's an elevated highway that's past its useful life. If the state of Connecticut decided to redevelop that area in a way that sunk this highway down below ground, maybe made some more surface area that would be developable, the thing that Colin's talking about right now could actually be possible. You could build cool stuff right next to the Aetna building in order to keep them there as opposed to giving them money to just stay there where they are.
It could keep them there, but it could also increase access and connect other parts that are there too. But again, telling someone that that's the long-term plan, that's not working right now. People in Hartford are saying, we're broke. We don't even have enough to sustain the schools that we have. Why am I focusing on this? If the governor wants a fast-track program, or if the governor wants this transportation lockbox, I'm against it because I can't see in the short term how it's going to improve my quality of life.
Danny Harr is looking at me like I'm a crazy person.
Yeah, the $12 billion needed to sink the highway for the 5 acres of property that you get. We've got acres and acres of underdeveloped property just to the west. In every direction from Aetna except to the south.
But don't they have to rebuild the highway anyway? They've got to rebuild the highway in some way, shape, or form. It's going to happen.
Yeah, we're going to rebuild the highway, but I think the best way to rebuild it is the cheapest way to rebuild it, which is to just, rebuild it. And at grade, this below grade, we're going to rebuild. Look what happened over at the $20 million that we got. It's a lovely skateboard park, and I really think it's a great thing, and it's a great asset. I was over there last night. But it's not $20 million worth because of that one little bridge over I-84. Recovering land by burying highways is not money we are able to spend.
Okay, speaking of spending money, before we take a break, a strongly worded editorial published in the Hartford Courant today. It's about the changing relationship between state Democrats and unions. Among the things said in this sharply worded critique, the Democrats did the right thing when they voted for a break on spending instead of higher taxes. If losing union support means less money or fewer volunteers to campaign for Democratic candidates, so be it. The Democratic Party should cut its own spending plans just like the rest of the state. That's in the Hartford Courant today, Colin.
Yeah, and in fact, the unions and also some allied groups more concerned about human services and issues of affecting minority populations, they're all apparently going to protest the Democrats' annual dinner, which is now has a new name that has progress in it somewhere, I think. But and I don't know.
State farm dinner.
in some ways, in some of the ways that Kalila was just talking about, though, it seems to me that those interests now compete rather than congeal, right? That there are a lot of underserved populations and vulnerable populations who are not getting services out of the state budget anymore, and the interests of many of the interests of the unions in not seeing their benefit packages, which are not suddenly, but are very, very heavily criticized by the Courant editorial today. They don't want to see any of those things monkeyed around with. Well, I mean, in some ways, you hate to put those two groups into competition, but they probably are in competition right now for dollars.
Danny?
At least now we're in a sane conversation about comparing operational dollars to operational dollars. The unions are saying spend money on us, don't spend money on X, Y, and Z, or raise taxes on the rich. That's an operational question. The question of borrowing $22 million to give to a rich hedge fund is not operational money. That's not $22 million we would have had otherwise, because you can't borrow money to spend it on your operations. Nobody will let you do that. I've suggested it. They don't like the idea. But it also, I'm sort of sick and sort of tired of the fact that everybody blames the unions for sticking up for their position. Nobody blames the hedge fund for asking for $22 million. They blame everybody else. Why do people blame the unions, as the editorial did today, for sticking up for their own position?
Well, I think the unions are doing what they're supposed to do, and that's representing the interests of their constituents, just as the lobbyists represent the interests of the business community or of hedge funds. So if you think about what are those interests and how it's going to affect people, that's where we need to talk about the jobs that will be lost, the loss of services, how the social ills that we aren't doing a good job with right now, how is that going to get even worse?
Dr. Kalila Brown-Dean, Associate Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. Dan Haar is also here. He's a columnist for the Hartford Courant. Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. When we come back, criminal justice reform gets a little bit of a haircut. We'll talk about that and more. You can join us 860-275-7266 in the Wheelhouse here on WNPR. It's the Wheelhouse here on WNPR. I'm John Dankosky. Joining me is Dan Haar, columnist for the Hartford Courant, Kalila Brown-Dean from Quinnipiac University, and our own Colin McEnroe. Hey, Colin, what's on your show this afternoon at 1?
Oh, well, we are going to do a special sports magazine show. We're going to talk to Ron Darling, who has written this very angsty book about why what it means that he pitched so poorly in the most important game of his life, the seventh game of the 1986 World Series. He compares it to, or describes it as an attempt to do what Somerset Maugham did in Razor's Edge, but do it to baseball. And also, we're going to investigate something that's really weighing on a lot of people's minds right now, the dominance of Nigerian players in World Scrabble.
I have been thinking about that.
Yeah, I know.
Sports coming up this afternoon at 1 o'clock on the Colin McEnroe Show. Hope you can join us. So compromise has been reached in Governor Malloy's Second Chance Society initiatives. Governor Malloy is dropping his proposal to allow 18 to 20-year-olds to be tried as juveniles. That was one big piece of it. Now the House is scheduled to reconvene on Thursday. Could still pass a measure to eliminate bonds for nonviolent misdemeanor offenders. The part that is being dropped was not politically appetizing to those running for re-election. What do we take out of this, Colin, the fact that this Second Chance Society initiative that has met so much praise for the governor is kind of being halved right now because of some political pressure? Yeah, so sometimes the smart political thing is kind of the sad policy thing. So they didn't want to get into any Willie Horton campaigns right now. Last week we talked about the possibility, maybe even the probability, that the Senate could flip, the state Senate could flip or wind up in an 18-18 tie. They don't want to lose races on this issue, so they don't want to do it. I will say that my disappointment about this is tempered by something I said last week, which is it was this whole idea of taking adult or 21-year-old offenders down and reclassifying them was going to be kind of an empty gesture if we can't deliver services to those people. So, in fact, the cuts to the budget, the things that we keep talking about here on the show, they affect stuff, the kinds of vocational and rehabilitative services that would have really made this much more meaningful. Right now, what we're really doing is just reclassifying offenders from adult to juvenile without the ability to do a lot for them. So I'm a little less disappointed than I otherwise would have been. But the bail reform piece remains in this proposal, Kalila, and for a lot of people who've been watching this very closely, that's at least as important, if not more so. It's a major step, and I think it's a much-needed reform. The fact that we've created debtors' prisons or reinstituted debtors' prisons is a problem. But what I think is connected to Colin's point as well, so much of this second chance is targeting people who never really had a viable first chance at staying out. So even if you can keep people out of prison, if you're not looking at the collateral penalties attached to an arrest or to a conviction, you create a cycle where people will keep being involved with the system for a longer period of time and really cost taxpayers even more. It's not keeping us safer in any way. Amen.
I agree with that, and I think we have to come to realize here that the second half of the second chance, the part about the age changes, came up not against a budget constraint and not against what often happens at the Capitol, which is simply a practical time constraint. There was time. They've had these 3 weeks. It came up against an ideological ceiling by the Democratic caucus that said, no, we don't want to do this. This is either bad optics or bad policy, and I don't know which one it is, but I don't think it's bad policy, but it certainly doesn't look good in the sort of Willie Horton sense. And it's important to note that this wasn't shot down for the wrong reasons. It was shot down politically for the right reasons because for rightly or wrongly, the caucus said, no, we don't want to do that change.
Well, it actually fits somewhat neatly into the next thing I wanted to bring up, Colin, which is periodically, maybe not periodically, all the time it seems at the state legislature, there are pieces of legislation like this that take years and years and years to bake. People maybe think that it's good policy, but now is not the good time. The abolition of the death penalty in Connecticut is indeed one of those things. We thought we had an abolition years and years ago, and then it was eventually signed prospectively. And now, just in this last week, since we last talked on this program, it seems as though the state Supreme Court has finally said we don't have a death penalty anymore in Connecticut.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to Kalila's comments on this because she's just gone to school on this a lot more than I have. I mean, I didn't really regard this as an interesting point of appeal. I mean, this particular one, to me, it's pretty much a settled matter. And it seemed unlikely, given the way things went the last time around, that the Supreme Court was going to go, oh, no, wait a minute, we got it all wrong. I mean, I would have been shocked if that happened. I am therefore not shocked that this happened. But, I mean, there are deeper and more far-reaching implications that I think Kalila is better equipped to speak to.
So it's important not just for our state, but the impact it will have on the national movement to repeal the death penalty. There are a number of states that were looking to Connecticut to see what is the best way to push for initially reform and then eventually abolition. And so if you're thinking about a state like Oklahoma where, they don't have the right drugs to execute people, so it's taking 2 hours to put someone to death, having Connecticut, having the court make this decision helps them make the case in a much greater way. So change is incremental and gradual, but states also learn from one another. And looking at the legislative process here in Connecticut and saying the legislature said it, the judiciary affirms it, that's important for the national movement.
Yeah, but I mean, what does Oklahoma really learn from Connecticut, though? I mean, I think there's a huge gulf between Connecticut and many of the other states that maybe have had problems putting people to death, and states that would like to see this reform take hold. I mean, I think those are two different things to a certain extent.
It also, there's, these national organizations that are participating in this discussion so that when the Oklahoma legislature was discussing this, they pointed to Connecticut to say, well, Connecticut did this prospectively. Why shouldn't we just outlaw it outright? And the question was, well, will it stand up in the court? So this is how that kind of statewide learning helps the broader movement.
Connecticut hasn't had a death penalty in the modern era. We're paying a lot of money, and I know it's not a money issue, but we're paying a lot of money to have no death penalty. In practical terms, the person longest on death row in 1989, Cedric, oh boy, I forget his last name.
Cobb.
Right. He is about halfway there now. Then it was 1989. I think that's, 27 years ago. So there is no practical death penalty. Obviously, Michael Ross was put to death because he sued the state and said, kill me.
And volunteered.
Right. That's he more than volunteered. He sued the state. And Joseph Mad Dog Taborski in 1960 also volunteered. He didn't have to sue the state in those days. So, the legal system has changed. But we don't have a death penalty, and we need to realize that we're arguing about something that we have not had in 60 years.
And maybe we're not really arguing about it that much anymore. I mean, I don't see this. I mean, notwithstanding our next topic, which is Bill Pettit's candidacy, I don't see this as a topic that is anything but laid to rest here in Connecticut.
Well, I would disagree just because, I still get people saying to me, you would feel differently if someone you knew were killed. And my response is always, well, actually, I wouldn't because I had that experience, and that's partially why I'm so opposed to it. It is an economic question because the amount of money that we spend on creating this mythical death penalty system is money that's not going to victim services. We've cut back support for families and victims over the last 2 years in this state because of our budget crisis. So if we're not dealing with those kinds of problems, we have even more instability in our community. That's the real danger to public safety, not someone who will serve life in prison.
One of the more outspoken advocates against the death penalty repeal legislation was, of course, Dr. William Pettit, who lost his wife and 2 daughters in the Cheshire home invasion killings. He spoke with Fox 61 after the Supreme Court decision was announced.
Today's decision is another example in the ongoing saga where it appears that more attention is paid to the perpetrators, the convicted criminals, than to the victims.
Of course, Colin, we know that this is the position of Dr. Pettit. We also know that the Hartford Courant and others are reporting that Dr. Pettit is set to run for the state legislature. Maybe this isn't something that we should be arguing or that we're really arguing as a state anymore, but he is certainly arguing it, and it seems as though he may have that to run on.
Yeah, and I think his candidacy, I don't want to call it inevitable, but I mean, it seemed like something that was probably going to happen one of these days. He's been very, very active at the state capitol. You will remember one year that the death penalty abolition failed in the Senate, largely because he backed Andy Maynard and Edith Prague down, got them to change their votes on this. In, I think it's 2012, I hope I have the year right, he and his family were very active in supporting Lisa Wilson Foley in her now somewhat notorious campaign. They actually launched their own statement personally attacking Andy Rohrabaugh in a way that I thought was kind of unattractive and unfair at the time. So, I mean, he's interested in the political process. He wants to get involved. One thing I'll say about this, it'll raise an interesting question for all of us, people who cover politics, Betty Baucus or whoever his opponent winds up being, is like, you know, we handle this guy for very good reasons with kid gloves. He's been through something we could not possibly imagine, a horror and a loss that's beyond comprehension. But I think at some point he has to be just a political I mean, I don't want to preface everything I ever say about this guy during a political race with, you know, I'm so sorry. I mean, now you're running for office, and I think you have to sort of take your lumps and understand politics is tough, and this is probably going to be a tough race.
When Dr. Pettit was considering running for Congress, I asked him why he would want to go from being the sympathetic hero who showed the world how to handle the most severe personal tragedy imaginable to someone who we're going to beat the crap out of. And, you know, he had a good answer to that. And I don't think that it's quite as gloves off stuff when you're running for the state assembly.
Not.
We kind of, you know, we in the media tend to kind of, you know, we're not digging into people's past and that sort of thing the way we do for sort of higher offices. But I think he's not, I wouldn't corner him as a one-issue candidate. He's a really smart guy, and he's going to be a great candidate.
And I think he has a lot to offer, but I also think it's very important that we not pit victims against one another or families against one another. I don't think that anyone can speak on behalf of all of them. But my conservative friends often tell me they're opposed to bloated, inefficient government. I can think of no more inefficient way of handling business than how we punish people in this country.
I want to turn quickly to national politics, but to have a local thread. Governor Malloy, of course, has been touted by many as a dream governor for progressives. Many others wonder about that name, but he's Hillary Clinton's surrogate, certainly. At the Democratic National Convention, he'll be co-chair of the Platform Committee. Now, Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders wants him off that because of what he calls professional, personal, and political hostility towards Sanders. Now, the DNC, Colin, has already rejected Sanders' request. I guess I just wonder what all this says about, you know, Dan Malloy getting to the national spotlight with Bernie Sanders essentially saying, I don't want this guy as part of the Platform Committee at the Democratic National Convention.
Well, I mean, Bernie's still making a series of moves, and I think the larger questions are sort of what's his overall strategy? Does he even know heading into Philadelphia what his overall strategy is most likely to be? So Malloy is one chess piece on the board. You know, you challenge things that you can possibly challenge. Last night, in kind of a parallel thing to this, the Democratic caucuses were meeting in congressional districts to figure out who's going to be the delegates who represent the votes for Sanders and the votes for Clinton. And again, the party's looking at this kind of the same question there, which is when we get Sanders delegates, are they going to be the kinds of Sanders delegates who, if and when Bernie says, you know what, I'm done. Now you can vote for Hillary. Go ahead. Are they going to do that, or are they going to be fight to the death kinds of people? Marty Dunleavy pointed out in Mark Pathaniokis' article that, you know, in 1980, 500 Kennedy delegates walked out of Jimmy Carter's speech in Madison Square Garden. They don't want that kind of thing going in there. So anything that they can do to sort of, you know, build peace, build harmony. But right now, Bernie's still throwing rocks, and one of them hit Malloy.
I'm just still not clear on what the strategy is here. You know, to hear politicians accuse other politicians of acting in a political way doesn't really make sense here. So if you're going to play in the party, then you have to understand the rules of the party and how they operate. This doesn't help any long-term strategy for Sanders to build this movement or this revolution that he and his supporters have been championing. This, to me, just seems like a futile effort.
I think that's exactly describes the dichotomy in Bernie Sanders' campaign between building a movement and making a statement now. And, for him to say we want Barney Frank out as rules chairman and Dan Malloy out as platform chairman, these are established Northeast liberals. You can bicker about one or another. And I think it bears pointing out that the very issue where Malloy and Sanders divide is over gun control, where Sanders is further to the right than Malloy. So it's certainly not an ideological issue, and it is, yes, political. And I think Sanders people have the right to say, that seems to be what I'm saying all day today. So they have the right to say, we want to remove these people, and maybe they do have the juice. It depends. If the party chair, Deborah Wasserman Schultz, doesn't make it, then the rest of them may not make it either.
I mean, there's plenty of precedent for kind of a scorched earth policy. And, I mean, I'm now committed to my position of being hated by absolutely everybody. So, I mean, I would just observe that, in 2008, Hillary Clinton stayed as long as she could, and she famously made that remark about, Bobby Kennedy getting shot, and I mean, so I better be ready because something like that could happen. So for her to now say, wow, people ought to just sort of get out of the way and get going, it doesn't necessarily even square with her own record.
I think there's a difference between getting people out of the way and then being the one to knock them off the island. So I just want to be in Philadelphia this summer. I think it's going to be great.
Now, before we take a break, since we last spoke, Donald Trump, of course, racked up enough delegates to become the presumptive Republican nominee for president. Now, yesterday he held a press conference to talk about donations he's made to veterans groups, but he also took some time to criticize the federal judge presiding over the class action lawsuit against Trump University.
Judge has been very unfair, has not done a good job. He's been a very bad judge. He's been very unfair. And I will win the Trump University case. I already am, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, a little bit of Donald Trump. This is the latest thing. Kalila, just in the same week that he gets all the delegates necessary, he's now the presumptive nominee. A number of people in the Republican Party are trying to figure out how to rally around this candidate that they have to hold their nose a bit with. Now he's coming out and he's criticizing the judge in this case using some unflattering language that we didn't even play there. I mean, I don't even know what to say now about Donald Trump. I can say that Quinnipiac University, the brand new poll, the place where you work, their new poll shows that Hillary Clinton has a small lead over Trump in a head-to-head matchup, 45 to 41% nationally, with third-party candidates still in the race. But in a head-to-head matchup, Bernie Sanders leads Trump 48 to 39%.
Well, I think it's also interesting to think about Trump's manager saying we're going to see a different side of Trump. He's going to become more presidential. This is quite the preview of, sort of demonizing the press and demonizing the judge, and then 2 weeks later deciding to pay out these veteran services organizations. I think we see exactly what we're going to get. It'll be interesting what comes out as some of these court hearings progress on Trump U.
We should also say that, I mean, I, once again, every time you think that Donald Trump is going to tone down his act enough so that he could be recognizably, an acceptable mainstream candidate, he reminds you that he's not. And part of his remarks about Judge Curiel were, and I'm just quoting from the New York Times editorial, for good measure, Mr. Trump added that Judge Curiel, quote, happens to be, we believe, Mexican. False. The judge is from Indiana, but the facts are always beside the point for Mr. Trump, who reassured his audience that the Mexicans are going to end up loving Donald Trump when I give them all these jobs. I mean, this man is not backing away from his racism.
The job building the wall.
Yeah, right. He's not backing away from his racism. He's a xenophobic nativist creep. And, he's not able, even when he's got people like Paul Manafort saying, tone it down a little bit, Donald. He can't, because this is who he is.
The reason he can't tone it down, and we were fortunate to be the state that was in play in the week when that came up as an issue. Yes. He was here the Saturday after the Tuesday of New York when he actually acted somewhat graciously, man-child that he is. And he came in and he showed us in Waterbury and Bridgeport that he doesn't actually know what it is to be presidential. He mocked being presidential, and in so doing, he demonstrated that he thought being presidential has to do with your momentary behavior. In fact, it has to do with your character. He's going to win the lawsuit on Trump University. Trump University was a scam and a sham and ripped people off. That is a fact that we all can look up and see and know, but his supporters are too seduced by his narcissism to know that and care. And that's the reality we have as a political situation here.
Dan Haar is a columnist for the Hartford Courant. Colin McEnroe hosts the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Kalila Brown-Dean is an associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. When we come back, are we going to get a ball yard in Hartford? We're also going to take a look at Keno. Yes, it's here in the state, and we're all very excited. It's next in the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse here on WNPR. I'm John Dankosky. Coming up tomorrow on Where We Live, for a century, Groton, Connecticut's been home to the Naval Submarine Base and Training School. It's turned into an economic staple for the region. The state's celebrating 100 years as the submarine capital of the world. That's what Lucy Nalpathanchil will be talking about tomorrow on Where We Live. I hope you can join us. Today it's our weekly news roundtable, and we're in the Wheelhouse with Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Dan Haar, a columnist for the Hartford Courant, and Kalila Brown-Dean, associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. Now, the city of Hartford has declared the developer of the minor league baseball stadium in default of its contract, gave notice to the developer's insurer. Yesterday, the developer met with city officials. No new update on when the stadium might be completed and whether minor league baseball will even be played in Hartford this season. I was doing a fundraising event last night, Colin, and one of the prizes, if you came in second in this contest, this trivia contest, actually was a series of tickets to the Hartford Yard Goats games. And I just thought it was comical because I was wondering when these people might be able to cash in. Is it this year, Colin?
I don't think we know, but I think it is certainly within the realm of possibility, unfortunately, that it's not this year. It would be easier to – I understand, by the way, why yesterday's meeting was pretty much shrouded in secrecy, and even after they met, they didn't really tell us anything, because it's become counterproductive for them to kind of play this whole thing out in front of the public and keep revising the dates when the stadium is going to be, quote-unquote, substantially complete and all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, I think we all have a compelling interest, particularly the people who are, all underwriting these bonds, in knowing what's happening. And I couldn't even tell from the coverage, because I don't think anybody covering it knows, was the bond company there? The surety company should have been there yesterday. The surety company's reaction, I think, would have been, because it typically is, no, everything's fine. This is going to be fine. You're going to get this thing done, because they don't want to pay a forfeiture bond. They have a compelling interest in getting this thing moving again. And I think everybody does. I mean, there really isn't anybody who isn't better off if this thing just gets done as fast as possible. So we don't want to have a forfeiture bond. We don't want this to go into court, which is where it can very easily go if people start challenging other people's behavior. Danny's wagging his finger and shaking his head.
I don't think it is true that there aren't people better off if this goes into forfeiture. The taxpayers of Hartford are up for between $4 and $5 million a year, and they're not getting their money's worth, and they need to stop the bleeding. Now, I'm not saying that should happen. I agree that they should work it out, get the stadium built, because it's always better to have an asset working than not working, no matter what the asset is, whether it's liquid or money or hard. The reality, though, is that there is a constituency that needs that benefits from the bond being called, and that is the taxpayers of Hartford.
And I also think Hartford needs this to work out, though. I think so much has gone into this. So many people have had questions from the very beginning of this project about whether it was necessary, whether it was feasible for this to fail. It's not just about government failing. It's not just about, these interests failing. It's really about, can this city move forward in a strong way? So do everything you need to do to get it done.
Well, and talking about stopping the bleeding, Dan, I mean, there's money that is supposed to be being made on everything from seats to hotels and everything else. I mean, I don't know how real any of the numbers were when the stadium deal was proposed, but there is an awful lot that the city of Hartford is losing out on right now. I mean, if we don't play baseball this year, what happens? I mean, the city of Hartford literally almost can't absorb the amount of money that it's not making off of this investment that it's made.
Well, that's right. And you have to remember also that the entire development is dependent on the stadium, for better or worse. And so the whole timetable of the whole development, apartments, supermarkets, beer stands, or breweries, everything gets pushed back. And the immediate effect is, if you lose a year, the Hartford taxpayers lose the $5 or $6 million. The real danger is that it simply loses momentum and doesn't get done.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, even to Dan's point about the taxpayers, first of all, we'd have to sort of see how the forfeiture played out, whether that wound up in court. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which the gratification of the taxpayers could be badly delayed by this process playing out any other way. The other thing that I would say is, based on everything that I've heard and people who've had tours there, they're very close. I mean, I realize that that's sort of cold comfort given how long this thing has dragged on, but they're very close. It would seem to me to a tragedy to derail the project at this point when they really are kind of closing in on the gap. That baseball should be played in Hartford this year if it's at all possible. I realize they're moving past the date when Solomon and the Yard Goats might have to pay rent and like a lot of other things like that. Still, symbolically, for the reasons that Kalila said, it should be played.
Now, I know we've been waiting a long time to see if we're going to play baseball here in Connecticut. Here's something, though, we've been waiting even longer for. Let's listen.
Are you ready for this? It's a whole new kind of fun. It's a new way to play, so come on.
Danny, do you know what this is? Do you know what the song is?
I give up.
It's the new theme song for Keno. Keno is finally here in Connecticut.
No!
It's like a bad 80s teen song.
It doesn't say the word Keno anywhere in the song, so it could be used for a lot of things. I mean, this could be a new jingle for the Hartford Yard Goats, Colin.
Yeah, it could.
I thought that's what it was.
It's a catchy little tune.
It is,
no question
isn't it?
about this. And so I guess the question about Keno is, I mean, we all had a lot of angst about how this went through, the process this went through to even get in the budget and where did it come from and all this kind of stuff. And now it's here and we have to be reminded that it's even here. I will say, though, that the things that we were concerned about Keno and the kind of social damage that Keno can inflict will probably be something that goes on in the shadows. I mean, I don't think the fact that we stopped caring about Keno means that Keno is capable of really doing a lot of damage to vulnerable populations. And it's the kind of thing like 10 years from now, somebody will do a study and we'll go, oh, wow, that wasn't such a good thing at all, was it?
Well,
quick thought?
To go back again, we've removed so many programs and services to reduce those kinds of consequences. Time will tell.
Keno is just a tax on the poor, and this is a sad commentary. Not sad only because of what it is, but because of, as Colin said, how it came about. It just snook itself in there at the last minute without any debate at the Capitol. This is just a disgrace.
My favorite verb of the day, snook. Well, one of the things we do here on the Wheelhouse is we pay attention to a lot of things we've been paying a lot of attention to, but we're going to try something new at the end of the program here, something we'll call the outer sphere. There's a lot of things that our friends pay a lot of attention to, including things that aren't at the top of the news. Quickly, Kalila, I mean, what's something you want to bring to our attention this week?
So I'm reading this really great book by Alondra Nelson called The Social Life of DNA. And so her question is, now that people are doing these ancestry studies and DNA matching, how does it shape their view of their citizenship in the United States? And how is it affecting social relationships of people who rediscover identity?
Give us a quick takeaway. That's really interesting.
Well, it's amazing because there are people in the book who identify as African American and then discover through ancestry matching that they're really 75% European. So does that create some sort of crisis of consciousness, or does it make them reimagine their relationship to the United States? And what is the ethical question associated with this kind of emphasis?
So again, the social life of DNA. Danny, how about you? What's something you're looking at?
Our friend Clinton Deckert from, I believe, Southington, who's the surrealist painter, has his exhibit at the New Britain Museum of American Art through, I think, Tuesday. It's a great exhibit, and it really works well together. There's some very striking, bold, classic, what I would call high-period classic surrealist paintings. You can also go see the Salvador Dali exhibit there. It's not American art, but it's collected by an American.
Is there a reason why you'd bring up surrealist art at the end of a program about the state budget? I mean,
it's unimaginable. The only thing better would have been Dada, and we've got that in New Haven.
Colin, how about you?
Well, last night I was at Anastasia, which is playing at the Hartford Stage Company. It's a Tuesday night. The theater is pretty much packed to the rafters, and you're going to see that in the weeks ahead. I love the Hartford Stage Company. I didn't particularly like this musical. I don't think I'm the target demo for it, but it is an opera. I was thinking, if you work at the Etna and you want something cool to go to, and the Yard Goats aren't playing, this is within walking. I mean, if you walked north from the Hartford Stage Company, you'd get to the Yard Goats Stadium right away. But this thing is up and running. It's a chance to see this is going to be a Broadway show. All the production values of the Broadway show are already in place. So if you don't want to pay $150 for a ticket and in New York and drive all the way in there if you want to see it cheaper and closer to home. You're effectively seeing a Broadway show. Not the kind of Broadway show that I'm particularly in love with, but you can take young people to it and they're going to love it. And the Hartford Stage Company is going to make a lot of money to put on the kinds of plays that I do like.
Well, and just very quickly on that, not the sort of play that you love because it's for a different target demo. It's
a very mass market style, almost sort of Disney style Broadway kind of show. If you want a show that I do love, playing down at the Norma Terrace right now, low budget, the roar of the grease paint, the smell of the crowd. It's the celebration of Anthony Newley's music set against the backdrop of a kind of Mad Max does Beckett afterscape. So that's a very cool musical too.
Excellent. Very good. And my last word on today's program is a little shout out to Farmington's Nick Bonino, who's spent this year centering the most productive line for the Pittsburgh Penguins. That's my hometown hockey team. They're in the Stanley Cup Finals, don't you know? He made a dream come true by scoring the winning goal in the final minutes of Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. He reacted, guys, like it was no big deal. He didn't even have a smile on his face. He's just like, I'm going to go get him again. So Nick Bonino, very good week. Keep it up for my Pittsburgh Penguins. Thanks to Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Thanks to Dan Haar from the Hartford Courant and Kalila Brown-Dean from Quinnipiac University. Thanks to Tucker Ives and Kyone Wolf with Heather Brandon and Katie Tolarski, who produced The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks for joining us.